am delighted to introduce our next two presentations by Miriam Moore and Neda Sahranavard, both based in the US. Their presentations are on the theme of global citizenship in English language teaching. Miriam?
Okay, I'm presenting the results of a qualitative study entitled A Refugee-Background Family Developing ESL and L2 Writing Skills. This is a slightly different subject or title than I had before, but part of the grounded theory study is it's organic and it tends to develop and change as you're doing your study. Here's an overview of the topic, and I'll just read through this quickly. Due to the challenges of displacement, English language learners with refugee backgrounds have unique language learning trajectories. That was the premise for the study. So I used a multi-generational family at various stages of English language writing skill development. And this study explores the multilingual writing process or their multilingual writing processes during their first year of resettlement. And there's a little bit of information about me. I have studied abroad when I was in college. I studied in Germany, and I lived in Mexico for 2.5 years. I taught there at a university. And I also lived in Spain, where I taught at an academy and trained professors at a university. And I was there for 4 years. And I also spent a few months in Portugal. I am bilingual. However, none of my experiences involve being forcibly displaced from my home. So while I had some things in common with my participants, there also were some challenges to accessing this population. So I'll talk about a little bit more about that later. But my research questions were, what defines the process of language development for refugee background students as they're learning to write in English? And what defines their writing process over time? And as I started the initial stages of data collection and analysis, I also added what role, if any, does the family unit play in second language development, because I saw the influence of family was something that I had not anticipated, but was very prominent. The purpose of this study, I wanted to develop a deeper understanding of writing challenges for refugee background English language learners and how they navigate and resolve such challenges. And this came from some experiences I had teaching refugee background learners. And I also wanted to identify features of their English language acquisition process outside of school settings. And I wanted to develop a working model of refugee background English language learners' writing development over time. Make sure this is okay. So in grounded theory, you don't start with a theoretical lens and apply it to your data, nor do you use the literature to guide the direction of your analysis, like in most studies that start with original data. However, just to give you some background and in the interest of providing some context for this study, some of the major themes from the literature, and I will circle back to these at the end, were academic writing support, empowerment, teacher training, writing as a social practice, and refugee education policy. So I'm not going to talk much about these until we get to the implications of the results. I used a grounded theory framework, and specifically constructivist grounded theory, which was founded by Kathy Sharmas. It comes from symbolic interactionism, which involves, it starts with the concept that we can observe action, and these actions have symbolic meanings for society. It uses inductive reasoning, and the researcher and participants co-construct meaning together. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to use this framework. It was less presumptive, and that you didn't start with literature and reasoning that comes from these kind of old institutionalized ways of thinking. But in order to do grounded theory, you also have to be analytic. And according to Sharma's, that means breaking up the data, seeing what it's made of, its properties, and how those properties emerge. And you have to define everything as you're going along. And that presents some challenges. My perspective as a researcher is from the sociocognitive paradigm. I'm talking about writing process, so obviously writing process theory, it was involved in my thinking as well. And these are the steps for conducting constructivist grounded theory. You start with a purposive sample of participants, and then data collection and analysis happens simultaneously so that the researcher can determine what further data needs to be collected. And this is called theoretical sampling, and it continues cyclically until theoretical saturation is reached. And this happens when you find that there are no new concepts are emerging as you're building categories from your data through your analysis. Okay, sorry, skipped ahead a little. In this section, I will talk about how I applied these methods. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. I did skip. Oh, that after you reach saturation, you then create a narrative that brings together all your codes, and those become, or that becomes your central theme, and you develop a narrative and then write a grounded theory report. So at this stage, I'm at the report writing stage of the process. And I want to start here from the beginning with my participants. So I started off with a totally different idea about what I could expect to find in the field. And my concept of how people, or how people with refugee backgrounds develop English language learning or English language skills and learn to write in English were based on my teaching experience. And my teaching experience wasn't necessarily helpful for conducting the study or for framing the study, but I'll explain that a little bit more later. These are not my actual participants. They're stock images from the internet. However, to protect their identity, I use pseudonyms and stock images. However, these do represent their gender and ages and their basic personalities. This is a family from Guatemala, and I'll give you a little background here. Maida is the mother of the two sons, Hector and Oscar. Hector is 27 and Oscar is 15. Celia is Hector's wife, and they have their own family. They have a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old. And they came here last year. Maida's husband was a labor representative who was murdered outside his workplace, and a government official was implicated in the murder. Maida pressed for prosecution of the hired gunman and his co-conspirators. The gunman was convicted, but she continued to press for the conviction of the person that had paid him. And she was threatened, and her family started to receive death threats as well. So the DA recommended that she apply for a program at the US Embassy to come to the US. They were accepted, and 2 years later they arrived, and that was last year. So this is the timeline for the project. I started in February of last year, and I'm currently in phase 7. And in this next slide, my data collection methods included observations from one-to-one, face-to-face English lessons that I had with Celia, Maida, and Hector, and from writing samples from all participants and interviews with Maida, Oscar, and conversations with Hector and Celia. The conversations were more informal and the interviews were semi-structured interviews. And I thought I showed this. Okay, this is the specific data that was included in the study. Class writing samples. The two women, Maida and Celia, had a course before I met them. It was a community-based course, and it was like a formal where they sat in a classroom, took notes, and had an instructor. And the writings that they produced from those sessions were included in the samples that I received. I also had 80 pages of worksheets that primarily came from Oscar's school, and it included not only his English courses, but all of his courses that he was writing in. And there was some other miscellaneous writing from text messages, social media posts, and additional field notes from my observations from our lessons, and also 5 pages of teaching notes, and 2.5 hours of interview transcripts, and 4 pages of field notes from the more informal conversations. So as I noted before, grounded theory is the methodology. So constructivist grounded theory not only comes packaged with its own theoretical framework, but also the method for collecting and analyzing the data. Using the constant comparative method to analyze the data is like playing a game of cards. You're comparing the cards on the table to the ones in your hand and speculating or theorizing about what the others have in their hand based on what you know so far about the data. And the constant comparative method requires that you make comparisons of various aspects of your study. You're comparing different data sets, like interviews with the writing samples and the observations, but you're also comparing the categories that you generate from those, and codes with categories, etc. But how do you generate a code, and what are categories? Here's an example. As I stated, constructivist grounded theory comes from symbolic interactionism. The method assumes there is symbolic meaning behind actions that can reveal the truth about society. And as you observe those actions, you describe them using a gerund. For example, this is a study area outside a university where I initially started recruiting participants. And in my notes, I observed the guy in the jacket with his back to the camera, and I wrote watching a video for the code. But to be more analytic during the focus coding, which is the level that you become more abstract with your data and more analytic, I wrote engaging with digital resources. So that's how the process begins. But if you are going to compare categories, participants, codes, etc., you also need to compare the kind of non-tangibles, the context and the greater concepts that are emerging from your data. So consider the difference here between learning in an environment with books and electronic text and videos, and Hector's daily on-the-job English lessons. This is where the difference between the refugee background English language learner and other English language learners emerge. How does writing develop in this context? Hector described needing English to, quote, survive. He learned from his coworkers and he would have them translate instructions for him. He learned from hearing and overhearing others. So then I'm no longer comparing learning from text. I'm then comparing learning to write based on speech, based on what you hear. Refugees' primary interactions may be through some form of survival. So that's a consideration. Here's another context. This is where the women had their lessons, and where Hector also had, where I met with Hector. We sat at the dining table that you see there at the back of the picture. But for the interviews, I sat here on the sofa, and it was something about changing that perspective that created a different dynamic, a more casual interaction. And I wanted to capture that with the picture, so that's why I took the picture. But that also had resonance because of the contrast between the different learning environments and how they described those learning environments when they talked about learning English back in Guatemala or learning English at the community-based program. And this will make more sense as we go along. So that's how I analyze the observational data. But what about the writing? This is an excerpt from a memo about the initial code entitled Writing to Improve Pronunciation. This memo helps me to think analytically and turn that code into the category of capturing speech. And so here it explains how when I was first looking at the sentences on the bottom that you see there, and other similar ones, I coded them misspellings and misunderstandings. Later, I saw this page with the alphabet that you see there at the top. And at first I didn't know what to make of it. Then I noticed there were two different pronunciation keys there. One in Spanish at the top, and one at the bottom, and then one in English at the top. And this wasn't in the book, and I hadn't asked her to do this. So at some point she did this, Celia did this on her own. So when I looked closer at the notes, I realized they were not just random misspellings. It was consistent with phonetic writing. So my memo analysis explored that concept of writing to capture speech. And that's also what I mean by you're comparing data with data. So I went back and compared the codes that I had created earlier. In this example,
Miriam, I don't think we're seeing the same screen as you. We only see the data collection methods. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So now we see the data analysis examples. Is that what you want us to see now?
Oh, okay. So let me go back a little bit here. This is the screen with the writing. And so, okay, so that was the last screen you saw, was the context.
Collection data methods.
Okay, so that was a lot that you missed.
Sorry.
Let me see. So I don't see what you're seeing. Did you see this screen?
No.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So, well, I will just go through the screens. This was the constant comparative method, comparing what's in your hand with what theorizing what might be in the data. And the context, the traditional context that we're accustomed to seeing, learning English in a formal environment. And then the non-traditional context, learning on the job. Are you saying the, yeah, okay, I can see what you're saying now. And then the other context was learning at home. So I was talking about observing them in these different contexts and making comparisons among those contexts as part of the analysis. And then the question was, but how do you analyze the writing? And here's the example of where she was writing and misspelling words, but then I realized these were phonetic spellings, not misspelling. She was writing the way, writing to learn the way that the words were pronounced. And so this is where I left off. In this example, entitled Capturing Meaning, or selectively translating and capturing meaning. There are lots of examples of this I wrote, but the most obvious one is in Talia's notebook, where she went back and selectively translated words in random assortment of sentences from the dictation lessons. So if you look at this, you see that I'm distinguishing capturing meaning from sense making, because capturing meaning is getting a rudimentary, quick translation to get the idea, but there's no deeper processing of the meaning. So here, this is a good example. In the margin, she wrote confianza, which is her translation of confidence. And she wrote to believe you can, para creer que puedes at the top. However, this definition is more like trust. It's not exactly right, but it gets the idea, and she would be able to use confidence in a sentence. And the same with here she translated the first word, nuestro, in the margin, but then she translated our teacher is funny and hot. I didn't dictate, somebody else did that. But funny here is translated as divertido, but in fact that means fun, not funny, but it still captures the tongue-in-cheek nature of the sentence. So she's getting the idea, and those are actually a lot of the text that I saw were along those lines in her notebook. Okay, so the other thing that the other question that I had was about the role of the family. And this came out of the analysis because family things kept coming up during the analysis. And I had originally started with this idea that of studying transitions from less complex writing to more complex writing by looking at the first year of college and comparing it to the last year of high school. But during the initial stages of the study, I get input from people from refugee backgrounds, and I started to realize that my premise was faulty, and there was a contradiction in starting with the idea that refugees have nonlinear education histories, but only looking at a linear transition, and thinking of this from a monolingual perspective, that they start out at point A, then go to point B, see, like that. So as I got more information, then I modified the questions and the participants to include not just a high schooler transitioning to college, but also other members of the family at various points in life. And I added the question about family because earlier in the data analysis, the flow of fluency it was clear that the flow of fluency is not perhaps a continuum, but an ebb and a flow, with the family unit itself serving as like the bridge between the cultures and languages. And the younger generation is a bit closer to the American side than the older generation. And their role is, in bolstering the family's knowledge of L2, of English, whereas the adult's role is to reinforce the traditional cultures and L1. So that was the kind of thing that was coming out of the data. But that's enough about my process. And I want to leave a little time for questioning. So the results. Here I have highlighted key features of their English writing and skills development. Modeling was basically copying, mimicking, redundancy. Okay, make sure you can see that. And capturing meaning was getting the general idea, using dictionaries and digital resources like smartphones to translate or Google things. Adjusting was, and I also had a subcategory of coping under this one. Adjusting was adapting behavior to changing circumstances, and coping was dealing with challenges and finding ways to overcome problems. So those are examples of the results, but let me give you a complete overview of all the different features of their writing development here. Let's see. These are the definitions of these terms. Individually, they provide a deeper understanding of refugee background learners' challenges and how they may navigate learning English. However, collectively, they tell an even broader story. So these features, make sure this is moving forward, yeah, apply to both the writing process and their English language development in general, which I didn't expect to see, but they all kind of converged in these features. The numbers on this are not that important, but it does show that while modeling, capturing meaning, and pursuing fluency were the basic building blocks of beginning fluency, there were more complex processes already underway in English, such as sense making and sociolinguistic bridging and creating community. And that was specifically related to the role of the family. So these are even more complex and advanced processes that you wouldn't expect to see during the first year of resettlement. So that was encouraging to see that. And so the results, as I said, collectively, there's a larger story here. What tied these codes together was even more interesting. The data revealed that the key feature of the language development, of their language development, was connected to establishing internal, external, and collective belonging. And some of the categories were obviously tied to belonging, such as adjusting and coping, sociolinguistic bridging, connecting the old culture to the, which was connecting the old culture to the new culture, or the L1 to L2, prioritizing, creating community, negotiating identity. Those codes were connected to belonging rather clearly, but it wasn't immediately clear that the categories that came from coding writing, such as awakening L2, pursuing fluency, modeling, the one that's like mimicking, and sense making, were also part of, also connected to belonging. But these categories, the key to these categories was the way that they wrote. And for example, Celia emphasizing communication and speech, and Hector requesting help from others, and Oscar helping others in his class from similar backgrounds, and Maida's editing and organizing her notes and rewriting them for practicing. The way that they, the types of activities that they were doing emphasized this concept of belonging.
Thank you, Miriam, for sharing your session in line with time. I know that you said you wanted to save room for questions, but we are actually over time. So I do want to get us going, Miriam. So thank you for sharing ways to use grounded theory to provide important stories and share critical insights on ways in which families from refugee backgrounds develop literacy skills. So I do want to allow room for at least one question. All other questions that you may have for Miriam, please put it in the chat, and so that she can respond to your questions in the chat room. Is there one question? I didn't see any come in the chat, but is there any one question for Miriam? Okay. All right. Again, if a question comes about later, please put it in the chat so Miriam can address that question. All right. Thank you, Miriam. You may stop sharing your screen. Now we're going to hear from Neda Sahranavard, who is presenting on adoption and adaptation of English in Iranian discourse. Neda?
Again, hello, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm so excited to share my research with you. My title is Adoption and Adaptation of English in Iranian Discourse, and I'm going to start introducing myself. My name is Neda Sahranavard. I am a lecturer and an assistant director at UCI, or University of California, Irvine, in the program in Global Languages and Communication, where I teach Persian and academic English. I also teach ESL at the South Orange County Community College District. I'm so honored that I was awarded as the Teacher of the Year with TESOL International Association in 2020. And my research interests include student-centered instruction, intercultural communication, teacher education, and world Englishes. Today, I'm going to talk about some background of my study. I'm going to share the purpose of this study with you all, and I'm going to share some patterns that I found in my study regarding Persianization of English in Iranian discourse, and then I, of course, share some conclusion. I'd like to start with some background about Iran. If you know Iran, or if you don't know Iran, I'm going to share a very brief background about Iran. Iran is famous for the ancient city of Persepolis, the Persian Gulf, its petroleum reserves, Persian cuisine, and other ingredients such as pistachios, caviar, and saffron, and also fine rocks. Also, Iran is famous for the Zoroastrianism, and also its world-renowned writers and poets, including Ferdowsi, Forough Farrokhzad, Hafiz, Khayyam, Parvin Etesami, Rumi, Sadi, and Simin Behbahani, among others. All above is true about Iranian legacy, but what I'm sharing today is focusing on Persian as it's kind of like adopting and adapting English and changing. The language is changing based on English, and Persian or Farsi is the official language of Iran. Some people call Persian the language, and some people call Farsi, so both are the same. In Iran, there's a tendency to view English language and Western culture with admiration. American English is considered the language of modernization, the global economy, and technology. And rapid transformation in the material life, technology, and education of Iranians has led to profound hybridized transformation of the of Persian language. And I have some resources that I'm sharing. Also, Persian is highly influenced by English. English is Persianized in Iranian everyday discourse, and even those people who have limited knowledge of English use English in their daily discourse. And English loanwords dissociated from their origin are prevalent, and I'm going to share some examples. I'd like to start some pictures that I took in Iran. These are in I took these pictures in 2022. This picture on the right shows the popularity of English institutions in Iran. And this one is a picture from a bookstore. I got permission from them, and I took a picture of all the English books that they sell in this bookstore. Also, you can see that, let's say, food delivery, the name of, let's say, this system is Snap Food, and then it has been Persianized to Snap, and food is food. And I'm going to talk about the details a little later. So I'm going to go back and share some brief history of English in Iran. So English was introduced to Iran in 17th century. Christian missionaries from Europe opened schools in Iran and brought modern education and Western development in 19th century. And in the 1920s, tuition-free schools and universities were modeled along the lines of American educational system. And English replaced French as the most desirable language in Iran in 1950s. And then English became the language of modernization, global economy, and technology in 21st century. The Academy of Persian Language and Literature, which was founded in Iran in 20th century, aimed to protect Persian from invasion of other languages. English was one of them, but they tried to create coin words for other languages so that for transparency and intelligibility in Iran. But despite this effort of the Academy of Persian Language and Literature, a lot of English words have been Persianized and used as coin words in Iran. So English loan words entered Persian. For example, words such as bank, police, machine, and post have been entered into Persian for simplicity and phonemic considerations. They didn't change the grammar of Persian, but they brought the English punctuation, such as comma and question mark, into Persian. There are some previous studies on the use of English loan words and phrases, on nativization of English, Englishization of indigenous languages, lexical transfer, code switching, code mixing, and discoursal and synthetic change of and accommodation, and also linguistic borrowing, which can be found in all aspects of language, indicates cultural change, and Persian is a very fertile field for studying the various aspects of linguistic borrowing, and this is by Jazairi in 1966. So I'm going to introduce the study based on the observed patterns. I mean, I observed patterns based on I taught English in Iran, and also I taught English here in the United States, and I had a lot of Persian students in my classes. So I observed a lot of patterns, and then I started investigating those patterns, and I conducted some interviews with 9 educated native speakers of Persian in Iran. They were residing in Iran, and I wanted to find first I started investigating the pattern of pronunciation, and I found other patterns as well. So I conducted semi-structured interviews virtually during the pandemic. So it happened in January and February of 2020. I use WhatsApp text messaging and video call application to do the interviews, and the language of the interview was Persian, but we would code switch as needed during our conversation. These are my research questions: how English words and phrases are Persianized by Iranians in their daily conversations, and what are some broad patterns of Persianization of English in daily Iranian discourse. So I'm going to introduce these patterns with you. The first pattern that I found was Persianized English as phonemic modification. As I showed you the picture earlier, the word snap, they not only they changed the spelling, but also based on the Iranian background, the word snap, the word snap, they add like a at the beginning. So they added vowel at the beginning of consonant clusters, like, for example, star becomes a star, or ski becomes a ski in Iranian context, or a sport. These are the words. And brand becomes berand, cream changes to kerem, and plot to pelot, based on the Iranian phonemic background. And also Iranians tend to replace P and T. For example, card becomes cart, and passport becomes passport. And vowels are modified. For example, package becomes package, and message becomes message. Business is business, and media is media in Iranian context. Another pattern that I found was semantic adaptation and adaptation, let's say. So there's a thin semantic shift between Persianized words used in everyday communication. For example, terror, the meaning of terror is used for assassination. Mark means designer. In Iranian context, instead of designer, people use, for example, mark, or instead of traffic jam, they use traffic, or instead of renting cars is like leasing means, first of all, they pronounce it leasing, and then it means car rentals, not like the concept of leasing in the United States or other countries where English is the language. The next pattern is Persianized English as innovative adaptation and combination. So Iranians innovate their own version of English. So by adding some prefixes to English words and combining some English and Persian, they create their own words. For example, the word laser, they add like an affix and then becomes laseri, which is a kind of like a combination of Persian and English, which means an object by laser. Or plak laseri, plaque, and laser means like license plate, which doesn't have any meaning if you say like laser plaque, doesn't have any meaning in English, but in Iranian context means license plate. Or khoshtip, the word type, is combined with the word khosh, which is Persian, together means good looking. The next pattern is Persianized English as set phrases, and Iranians tend to translate and use English set phrases and let's say collocations in their daily conversation. For example, student body is translated to student and body by itself, like badane danishjuyi, or the ball is in your court, toop dar zamine to. So it's been translated word by word. And I found other examples that I didn't have time to share today. I would like to share that it's important to notice that even those people who don't have any background in English, or they have a very limited English background, they use English words in their daily conversation. So in conclusion, adoption, adaptation, and appropriation of English is prevalent in Iranian discourse. Iranians' attempt of joining the globalized world is evident by using Persianized English as their home dialect. A very creative negotiation of English codes and values are evident in daily Iranian discourse. And a momentum of linguistic playfulness is also evident. English is also a tool to introduce Iran's rich resources and values to the rest of the world for Iranians. It also creates a new identity for Iranians, and as like personal identities and for their professional purposes. So contemporary Persian is rapidly changing and appropriating to the globalized world. And my broader conclusion is English words and phrases have been creatively adapted, and appropriated by speakers of Persian. Persianized English words and phrases frequently used in Iran. Everyday discourse is evident, and a reflection, and that's the evidence of a reflection of Iran's ongoing socio-linguistic globalization. Further research is needed to have more samples of public discourse in Iranian context to investigate the abundance and trajectory of these changes and the degrees to which Iranians are receptive and they want to use these changes in their daily discourse, and the effects of those linguistic changes on Iranians' cultural practices is also needed. That's all I wanted to present. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. And this is my email if you're interested in asking questions by sending an email to me. I'm happy to answer. Any questions? I appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Dr. Sahranavard, for sharing
Of
such
course.
fun work in the Iranian discourse. It was quite interesting to hear ways in which the English language is adopted and appropriated for greater access for students. I'm wondering,
Thank you.
Usually there's this conflict because sometimes within local discourses, we get comfortable with ways in which we have appropriated and utilized English to build communities. But usually when we go to the classroom, we're kind of stifled in how we use it. Now we have to think about standards and so forth. Within Iran, do teachers, I don't know, create lesson plans that incorporate these types of code switching methods?
Sorry, your question is in Iran or outside of Iran? Because I've taught English in both in Iran and US. So
whichever you're most comfortable with sharing, I'm wondering if it's, I don't know, if it's mostly shared or created within the Iranian context.
You know, to my knowledge, in my classes when I teach English, especially like here in the United States in Irvine Valley College, I have a lot of Iranian students in my class. And I help them to improve, let's say, their pronunciation and sometimes the semantic appropriation of English. They come with, oh, for example, this word means this, but it doesn't mean that specific, doesn't have that specific meaning in American context because it's different, and they bring their own definition of let's say English to the classroom. So for me, understanding this background helps me help my students. But at the same time, based on world Englishes and then the way that we focus on different Englishes, not one aspect of English. So I also empower my students and tell them it's okay to have a little bit of accent if, for example, it's very difficult for you to, for example, pronounce TH, you know, understanding that TH does not exist in an Iranian context. So it's okay to pronounce, for example, a little bit different, slightly different from American accent, but for the purpose of communication and clarification, you have to work on your, let's say, pronunciation in this way. So I don't know if I answered your question. So in my class, I use this as a tool to empower my students and teach them how to better communicate with American people or people around the world.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions?
I also have some questions for, I mean, these are the references that I have used. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to share them for this study I've used. And I have also some questions if anyone is interested in answering these questions. For example, if you have noticed any types of these patterns in other languages, or if you have students who use different versions of English in your classroom, or what are the benefits of using and being aware of these patterns in classrooms and beyond. If anyone is interested in sharing. There's one.
It's okay. You know, it's a lot to think about because these are some very critical questions. And, you know, if we do have questions, we can always add it to the chat and continue the conversation. So the
Mhm.
conversation doesn't end once their presentation ends, it continues in the chat.
All
So
right.
that's very important.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you, for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed this symposium. Thank you.
Oh, it looks like Jody
Oh, yeah.
Johnson.
Mhm.
Yes, hi. I appreciated the point that you brought out regarding how your students will create an English language based on their own need.
Mhm.
You know, it shows where we I'm sorry, it's been a long day, but you know, where almost like a code switching. So even
Mhm.
though it may not be proper English or the English that has been taught, but it is the English in which the group understands.
Mhm. Yeah, that's correct. So if they are in their own NIM, let's say first language group, the group understands, but it's slightly different from the English that we use in the United States, let's say.
Yes, and that takes some sophistication as well because the students are showing that they're using metacognition. They know what they don't know, so they're
Mhm.
creating a language that they understand in order to communicate.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I think we have a question from Sierra.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for your amazing topic, which I actually love a lot because
Thank you.
I've found that more teachers who haven't had as much experience, whenever you have students who switch into their quote unquote broken English, they think that they're messing up the language when they're actually showing a heightened level of comprehension for the language.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
that they are finding a way to meld the two together to make it work for their given population. Like my favorite example is McDonald's, you know, which is universal. Everyone knows the arches, but they say McDonald's completely differently. And when I lived and worked in Korea, or lived and worked in Koreatown in Los Angeles, it wasn't McDonald's, it was McDonaldo's. And
Mhm.
if you say McDonald's, they'll stare at you like, I don't know what that is. But if you break it down phonetically in that form, or the same with a lot of my Turkish students, adding, like how you said, the A in front of things,
Mhm. Yeah.
adding the E in front of things is not so much a pronunciation issue, it's an incorporation issue. And thank you.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And Iranians pronounce like McDonald.
And nothing's wrong with either pronunciation.
Yeah.
So, you know, we don't, it's an asset for sure. It's
Yeah.
always an asset.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that.
All righty. So thank you so much again for sharing your work with us.